I want to share today some thoughts from my book, From the Spirit of Our Politics. And the book puts together the topics of religion and politics, which are the two topics you're not supposed to discuss in polite company. I'm sure we've all heard this phrase. It seems in some ways ever more wise, given the way things have turned. I've come to think the saying is generally true, but for opposing reasons. People don't want to talk about politics because they hold their views too tightly. Too much of their identity is staked in politics. People don't want to talk about religion because they are haunted by the idea that they do not stake their lives in the spiritual things enough, that God takes up too little space in it. In his essay, Membership, C.S. Lewis writes, "A sick society must think much about politics as a sick man must think much about his digestion. However, if either comes to regard it as the natural food of the mind, if either forgets that we think of such things only in order to be able to think of something else, then what was undertaken for the sake of health has become itself a new and deadly disease." Our culture and many people in our churches are sick with that new and deadly disease. Politics is causing great spiritual harm, and a big reason for that is Americans, including many Christians, are going to politics to get their spiritual needs met. We cannot separate out the kind of politics we have, our laws, our political leaders and institutions, our political culture, from the kind of people we are. Our politics is doing great harm materially and spiritually, and if that is to change, it is vital that we recognize the ways in which our politics is ours. If we were a different kind of people, our politics would be different. And so I want to talk to you this evening about the space politics is taking up in your life, about the space Jesus takes up in your life, about the kind of person you are and the kind of person our politics needs. First, let's talk about the kind of politics we have. And I'm going to introduce a few terms that will set some context for us. In October 2020, 15 scholars from a range of fields came together to issue a dire warning about the particular kind of polarization we have today, which they termed political sectarianism. Political sectarianism is the tendency to adopt a moralized identification with one political group and against another. It is upheld by three pillars. It contains, the scholars said it's a toxic cocktail of three ingredients. Othering, which is the tendency to view opposing partisans as essentially different or alien to oneself, to place opposing partisans as sort of outside the boundaries of normal human community. Aversion, which is the tendency to dislike and distrust opposing partisans. And moralization, or what I call a misplaced moralization, which is the tendency to view opposing partisans as an interesting word choice here, as iniquitous. The scholars say moralization is the tendency to view opposing partisans as iniquitous, elevating political disagreement to the level of sin, to pure good and evil, as opposed to merely wrong-headed. What does political life look like when it runs on the fuel of aversion, othering, and a misplaced moralization? The scholars write, out-party hate has become a more powerful than in-party love as a predictor of voting behavior. Out-party hate has become more powerful than in-party love as a predictor of voting behavior. In other words, political hatred has become so profound that it outstrips many individuals' desire to actually help themselves, not to mention loftier motivations like pursuing the common good. Political sectarianism is a state in which we hate our opponents so much we'll do harm to ourselves and our interests before we concede anything to them. In addition to political sectarianism, I want to introduce another concept to you which compounds and helps explain political sectarianism, and that is the term political hobbyist. The political scientist at Tufts, Eitan Hirsch, explains that political hobbyist is a, quote, catch-all term for the person who spends a lot of time consuming news or signing online petitions or engaging online with people about this or that issue. They mistake this for actual politics, but it's not, because it doesn't contribute to power building. The prototypical political hobbyist will follow the latest national political controversy and know the ins and outs of all of that intrigue. Yet if you asked him how he could get involved on some issues of importance in his local community, or where the pressure points are in his community to influence government, he has no idea. He's just caught up in the national news cycle, and he's not actually improving anything. If you asked a political hobbyist, are you burnt out from politics? They'd say, yes, I am. If you ask them, well, what campaign are you working on? How many doors have you knocked on this week? They'd say, oh, no, not that, but I did spend 5 hours on Reddit last night. And man, I really ripped some folks into pieces, you know? Hirsch continues to explain, online politics is all about provocation and signaling outrage. But changing people's minds, turning your vote into many votes, requires empathy and face-to-face engagement. Not only are you not doing this online or when watching cable news, you're learning exactly the wrong skill set. Political hobbyism is a problem because political hobbyists are making politics worse. Here's Hirsch again. Our collective treatment of politics, as if it were a sport, affects how politicians behave. They increasingly believe that they benefit from feeding the red meat of outrage to their respective bases, constantly grandstanding for the chance that a video of themselves will go viral. In treating politics like a hobby, we have demanded they act that way. The average citizen is not a political hobbyist. Political hobbyists are one category of people who, in general, find in politics a form of entertainment, a method of gaining emotional satisfaction. There are others who reject politics, understandably, because they do not find emotional satisfaction in it. In both cases, it is one's emotional satisfaction that is far too determinative of whether and how one approaches politics. Perhaps emotional satisfaction should not be the guide for whether one chooses to participate in politics or not. I'll introduce one other term this evening, and it's one I coined and introduced in the spirit of our politics, and that is political therapeutic deism. The sociologists Christian Smith and Melinda Lundquist Denton introduced the term moral therapeutic deism in their 2005 book, Soul Searching: The Religious and Spiritual Lives of American Teenagers. Moral therapeutic deism, MTD, describes a dominant system of beliefs that the researchers found among adolescents at the time through thousands of interviews. The research rightly sparked concern among many, particularly conservative Christians, since MTD is made up of beliefs that are not necessarily Christian, but seem to fit comfortably into the culture of many churches and Christian homes. In a conversation with Dallas Willard, John Ortberg defines MTD this way: whether or not somebody would put themselves in the Christian or other category, so regardless of whether one is a Christian or not, MTD is the kind of prevailing idea about God. And the notion is that there is a God. God does exist. He wants everybody to be nice. That's the moralistic part. He wants me to feel good about myself. That's the therapeutic part. And he's available if I need him in a crisis. But other than that, I really don't have to think about him much, and he doesn't want to and will not interfere with my life. MTD offers a God who will not interfere with real life, except to the extent that the God of MTD affirms a person's moral goodness and destiny. Now, it is true, again, that politics is causing spiritual harm in this country. And a big reason for that is people are going to politics to get their spiritual needs met. What is also true is that people are going to church to get their political views affirmed. It was conventional wisdom among many evangelicals that churches that prioritize politics would inevitably die out because people can get their political fix elsewhere. And we do see some evidence of this. However, we are also seeing and observing the power of religious expressions that sanction and anoint people's political views. It's political therapeutic deism, a kind of religious perspective that exists to offer divine affirmation of one's politics. It's made up of these kinds of beliefs. Maybe some of these will sound familiar to you. First, God is on my political party's side. Second, my views on political issues are a leading indicator that I am a true Christian. Third, my actions in politics are justified in light of God's general approval of my politics. Fourth, I do not understand how other Christians could vote for my candidate's opponent. Fifth, it is clear and obvious to me which political issues are most important to God. Accordingly, while the 20th century saw the rise of seeker-sensitive churches and that model of doing church, what we are seeing in some places, in some churches now, is the rise of politics-sensitive churches. Some churches are attracting and losing members, attracting and seeking to repel members on the basis of their political appeals or lack thereof. Our political culture is both infecting the culture of our churches and making it more difficult to see the ways our faith can help us reject and renew our toxic politics. The very antidote our faith provides is made anathema because it threatens what we really actually trust. So to begin this talk, I've offered some ways, some concepts of thinking about the state of our politics. Of course, this account only skims the surface of our political disrepair. Much more could be said. We could talk about various policies and sociological and economic facts. The structures and the policies of our politics are incredibly important. But what I've begun to make the case for here by sharing with you about political sectarianism, political hobbyism, and political therapeutic deism, what I've become convinced of after 17 years of experience working in politics, is that the state of our politics is at the end a reflection of the state of our souls. The kind of people we are has much to do with the kind of politics we have. You are not one person in politics and another person in your personal life. You're just you. Thoughts, feelings, and actions that are characteristic for a person when they are dealing with politics are not quarantined off from the rest of the person. If you are the kind of person who lies during political arguments to get your way, you are the kind of person who lies during political arguments to get your way. If you are the kind of person who wishes ill to fall upon those you disagree with politically, you are that kind of person. So what kind of person are you? This is the question, not just when it comes to politics, but when it comes to life, when it comes to life with Jesus. Dallas Willard defined joy as a pervasive and constant sense of well-being. How many of you would describe our current political climate as full of a pervasive and constant sense of well-being? How many of you would describe your own approach to politics in that way? Might it be a problem that so many of us don't see politics as a place for joy? Where else do we think the way of Jesus isn't quite realistic? Spiritual formation, Willard wrote, without regard to any specifically religious context or tradition, is the process by which the human spirit or will is given a definite form or character. This process happens to everyone. We each become a certain kind of person in the depths of our being, gaining a specific kind and type of character. Now, this is a really important thing to understand. It's important to understand as you think about yourself. Your spirit has a character, and it is being shaped and directed every day. And again, spiritual formation is not something that you can just turn off when you're thinking about money or your relationships or politics and turn back on in moments of convenience. Our society, politics, and churches are hampered by a technological conceit that we can attain the kind of society we seek without coming to terms with the kind of people we are and without becoming a different kind of people. Societal change, real, lasting societal change, is not possible without coming to terms with the nature of the problem. C.S. Lewis describes how thinking of politics leads quite naturally to thinking about formation. A Christian society, he wrote, is not going to arrive until most of us really want it. And we are not going to want it until we become fully Christian. I may repeat, do as you would be done by till I'm blue in the face, but I cannot really carry it out till I love my neighbor as myself. And I cannot learn to love my neighbor as myself till I learn to love God. And I cannot learn to love God except by learning to obey him. And so, as I warned you, we are driven on to something more inward, driven on from social matters to religious matters. Dallas Willard affirms the basic point, citing T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot once described the current human endeavor as that of finding a system so perfect that people no longer have to be good. Willard replied to that idea, which Eliot thought was folly, by the way. He was identifying a human urge, not saying this is a good idea, carry on. Willard replied, the way of Jesus tells us, by contrast, that any number of systems, not all to be sure, will work well if we are genuinely good, and we are then free to seek the better and the best. As Christians, we care about politics because we care about our neighbors and our community. And political decisions impact our neighbors' well-being. In societies with representative forms of government, you do not choose to have political influence, you already have it. Therefore, sitting out of politics does not absolve you of blame for the state of our politics. Your sitting out is your choice about how to steward the responsibility you have been given. Politics is one of the essential forms in which we can love our neighbor. One of, not the essential form, not the only form. It's one of the essential forms in which we can love our neighbor. To love our neighbor is to will their good. And it is this that drives Christians to politics. As Christians who seek to follow Jesus, we seek to do in politics what we seek to do with all of our lives, which is to place that which is within the range of our effective will under God's will. You see, God's kingdom is the range of his effective will, or what he says should be done. And with our little kingdoms, that which is within the range of our will, we want to place all that we have say over under the jurisdiction of love. We want to act in the knowledge of the glory of God and in light of who God is and what he thinks about those he has made. I think Lewis was saying something like this when he said in his famous sermon, The Weight of Glory, that it is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses. To remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or also horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long, we are, in some degree, helping each other to one or other of these destinations. Now, often people end the quote there. Lewis goes on to say, it is in the light of these overwhelming possibilities. It is with the awe and the circumspection proper to them that we should conduct all our dealings with one another, all friendships, all loves, all play, all politics. We will approach politics best when we do not think of politics first. There are real structural problems with our democracy, and neither the popular will nor our individual wills are perfectly translated in our politics. And yet the structural issues are not completely removed from the will of citizens, from that which we promote, desire, and allow. And we must be willing to take the responsibility that is ours. The Christian's responsibility for our politics is special, but not because Christians are or should be privileged by law, or because America is a Christian nation. For too long, Christians have asserted special status for this country, all while avoiding special responsibility. We share with our fellow citizens, Christians and others, the responsibility in and for our politics in the eyes of the law. Yet Christians are also called by God to be a blessing to the cities and nations in which we've been placed. This calling does not bestow special status or privilege. It is a call to service. And so with what remains of my talk, I want to share with you three kinds of Christian resources that would bless our politics: ideas, practices, and people. First, ideas. When we think of Christianity and politics, often what comes to mind is a set of policy positions. Now, there is certainly a role to play for Christian resources to inform how we think about policy challenges and the issues of the day. I've spent much of my life in policy advocacy. I think our politics desperately suffers from a lack of Christian resources as a contribution to decision making. But I've become convinced that perhaps the greatest offering that Christianity has for our politics in this moment is not in telling our politics what it is, or what it must be, or what it must do. Instead, perhaps the greatest way for Christianity to bless our politics and our public life today is not to tell our politics what it is, what it must be, but instead to remind our politics what it is not. Here are 6 ideas or truths about politics that Christians can bring to our own approach to politics, to our communities, and to the broader public. First, politics is prudential. It is the area not of the dogmatic, but the prudential. It rarely, if ever, allows for the direct implementation of indisputable principles, but rather has to do with an imperfect choosing between competing values and goals. Second, politics is not ultimate, but penultimate. It is important, but it is not everything. Politics is penultimate, which means that politics can be informed by the ultimate, but is never the ultimate itself. The moment we step into politics, we are at best translators of ultimate ideals into the prudential and penultimate realm of politics. And we are imperfect translators at that. Third, politics is contingent. The propriety of a political decision relies in part on the particular circumstances of the moment in which it is made. A wise political decision in one time and set of circumstances will likely be foolish in another. Fourth, politics is for advancing justice and affirming human dignity as it relates to self-government. Fifth, politics is an essential forum for loving your neighbor, for willing or intending their good. And then finally, much political action, especially voting, is mediated by structures and community. The vote is not a pure expression of one's personal will. It's mediated. Now, these 6 ideas about politics, they naturally lead to humility, curiosity, and grace. They undermine political sectarianism, and they'll direct us away from political hobbyism and political therapeutic deism. The second set of gifts Christianity has to offer our politics are practices. Now, I could and have given talks entirely on this subject. There's an entire chapter on it in the spirit of our politics, but I'll offer here just a word on practices and share a few that I think are especially helpful in this political and cultural moment. A discipline is an activity within our power that we engage in to enable us to do what we cannot do by direct effort. Spiritual disciplines help us to be active and effective in the spiritual realm of our heart, now spiritually alive by grace, in relation to God and his kingdom. They are designed to help us withdraw from total dependence on the merely human or natural, and to depend also on the ultimate reality, which is God and his kingdom. In the spirit of the disciplines, Dallas Willard provides 2 categories of spiritual disciplines, those of abstinence and those of engagement. Disciplines of abstinence involve the planned temporary foregoing of the satisfaction of normal, even healthy desires. Abstinence involves purposeful self-denial so that we might, quote, bring these basic desires into their proper coordination and subordination within the economy of life in God's kingdom. Disciplines of engagement involve the taking up of certain activities. If disciplines of abstinence generally counteract tendencies to sins of commission, the disciplines of engagement counteract tendencies to sins of omission. Both kinds of disciplines are required, and they work together as a proper abstinence actually breaks the hold of improper engagements so that the soul can be properly engaged in and by God. In and through it all, Jesus is at the center. We follow Jesus' lead into any practice we take up, and we seek to learn from him in the midst of these practices. We know that we are not saved by these practices, just as we are not saved by merely holding the right ideas about God or the right views regarding issues of social justice. Relatedly, the point of spiritual disciplines, the aim of spiritual formation, is not behavior modification. Our principal aim is not what we do, but who we become. We aim at the heart and its transformation. We want to make the tree good. We do not aim just to control behavior, Willard wrote, but to change the inner castle of the soul, that God may be worshiped in spirit and in truth, and right behavior cease to be a performance. I've come to believe that life with Jesus is the only kind of life that forgoes the need for performance. Create in me a clean heart. This is the cry and desire. Psalmist, the longing of the disciple. And in my book, I describe a range of practices and disciplines, including both practices we learned from the life of Jesus, and which have been found helpful and edifying for millennia, as well as what I refer to as 21st century spiritual disciplines for our public life. Prayer, fasting, worship, celebration, study, these are the kinds of disciplines which have shaped followers of Jesus and fueled social movements. These practices are one way we come to know for ourselves that we can follow Jesus with the whole of our lives. There are two practices that tend to go together that I think are particularly essential in this moment, and those are solitude and silence. Solitude and silence push back against some of the most destructive attitudes and impulses in our politics. In solitude, we, quote, purposefully abstain from interaction with other human beings, denying ourselves companionship and all that comes from our conscious interaction with others. Solitude frees us. Solitude frees us from the need for others' approval to justify our existence. Solitude frees us from the noise of our politics and the moneyed forces vying for our attention and adherence. In solitude, we can be reminded that we exist apart from the constant sustenance of others' opinions and the endless stream of inputs and distractions that make up so much of our lives. It can be quite shocking to find that just a day in solitude can open up space in our thoughts and feelings and provide new perspective. Away from the clutter and bluster vying for our attention, we might even discover that we have a soul. We discover a God who cares for our soul, and we can retrain our heart to focus on him. In solitude, we refrain from interaction with other human beings, while in silence, we intentionally seek the absence of manufactured noise, including our own talking. Silence can be terrifying. We are comforted by noise. Different noises make us feel fun, productive, in control, alive. But what do we hear in the silence? Who are we there? Solitude and silence are disciplines that can break the chains of performance. They provide separation from the never-ending assessments of others and the unthinking adjustments we make in response to social cues and requirements. They help us reset our social and political tendencies. They will help us reassess our behavior and outlook in the social realms. And they can help us identify where we didn't see God and where we didn't invite him. We may realize how often the impulses of aversion and othering and moralization, not to mention anger, resentment, pride, and fear, are incited by our political and social environment, rather than inherent and unavoidable responses to reality. And so practices like solitude and silence, along with others, can be used by God to change us. We will find ourselves capable of serving others, even in our political life, in powerfully loving ways. So I'll just conclude by talking about the third subject I want to talk about, which is people. And if we have more time, I talk to you about specific people in history, models that we can hold up. But instead, I'll just have to close by talking about you. God's great plan, his great endeavor, does not depend on the outcome of an election or the success of a policy proposal. It is a great wonder that God, in all his power and wisdom and knowledge, has chosen to work in and through people. His great concern seems to be and include the kind of people we are becoming. What kind of person will you be? Might God be calling you to be in the midst of our political life? What if your family, what if the seminary, what if your churches made a commitment that politics, as with every area of life, is a place for you to live your faith? What if you made a commitment that you, your family, your church would shine as a beacon in a culture that so often seeks to place politics as outside and irrelevant to the gospel, or above and more important than the gospel? And instead live as though you view politics as falling within and under the gospel. What if you made a commitment to one another that your political opinions run secondary to your commitments to one another? What if politics, instead of serving as the source of frustration, division, and social conflict in our lives and our churches, became a forum in which we were actively seeking to follow Paul's call in Colossians 3, to rid ourselves of anger, rage, malice, slander, and instead to clothe ourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience? You see, our politics tells us that rage and malice are necessary and effective. But we have knowledge that suggests different. We can live it out. We can prove it with our lives. What if in the midst of a frantic public square, our churches and our families were embassies of joy, of a pervasive and constant sense of well-being? I've been traveling quite a bit, and there's so much to be hopeful about. So many wonderful churches and colleges and people seeking to follow the Lord. As I talk with people in this political season, I find that many are talking as if our politics simply happens to us. There's a passivity that concerns me. There's a lack of agency or a sense of agency. I was in the UK just last month. And the question in the UK was, are we on the same path of division that America seems to be far ahead of? And I'll tell you what I told them, which is that no path towards a bad thing is inevitable for the church in the UK, for the church in America. We do have to contend for something different. Division won't just not happen. We have to contend for hope. We have to contend for love. And this is our inheritance, this treasure in jars of clay. Woe to us if we forsake it in such a time as this. Our politics tells us that it is ultimate, but the psalmist says that we can be people who have no fear of bad news, whose Lord leads them beside still waters. I want to be like the man Jesus talked about, who found a treasure hidden in a field and sold everything he had to buy that field. What do you want? What are you here for? I don't want the trappings of God. I want God himself. And I want him everywhere. I want to put on the things of Christ. I want to be so full of love for God that I'm free to love my neighbor, to will their good. This is what we need. This is what our politics needs. May God help us want what he wants, as he has promised and is faithful to do. Thank you. Let's
Thank you so much, Michael. And not sure the format here. If you want to remain standing, feel free to grab a seat. I know it's a very energizing talk, and we deeply appreciate it. I'll join you from right here, and I'll just briefly summarize some of what I heard.
Great.
And just a remarkable and wonderful presentation. We deeply appreciate it. As soon as I picked up the book and used the quote again tonight, the state of our politics is a reflection of the state of our souls, and you gave us an overview of the two components of that at the start of your talk. And you talked about politics being one essential forum for the great commandment to will the good of others. You talked about the approach being best when we don't put our politics first, and Christians have a special responsibility to service through politics. And then you talked about three kinds of resources, ideas, and you mentioned that policy is important, but it's important to remember what our politics is not. It's not a direct implementation of indisputable principles, nor is it ultimate. It is penultimate. These ideas are really critical to remember, and you mentioned several others. Practices digging into spiritual disciplines in pursuit of Jesus and shaping our heart, not behavior modification. And then people, and you turn to all of us that God cares so deeply about each one of us and who we're becoming, and that we contend for hope, love, and a better public life. So thank you for that. And yeah, I'm energized and excited to dig in here. Saha, does anyone have any questions on the chat? Okay, anyone on the chat, feel free to jump in. I have a few questions, but I see a hand up in the room, so feel free to jump in. Kristen, go ahead, please.
I think that was a great talk. I really appreciated the ways you kind of framed where we are as a country and as a church. One of the things that struck me is, you know, when you were started off with the three things that we have as the greatest resources to tell politics what it's not.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I came to mind is, and this might, in some ways, I wondered if there have been failings of the big C church and politics have had to step in to fill that void because we have not maybe filled some of the pieces. So in caring for the poor, in, you know, looking for the underserved, perhaps the church has not always done its job in doing that. And so politics has kind of maybe filled that void. What would you say for us? And I really liked how you ended it with us as individuals of how we are really called to serve and to love. What kind of command would you say to the church as a whole and as a community of what our responsibility is to kind of help combat and putting politics back more in its place?
Well, I appreciate the question. There's much to say here. Willard has this, and by the way, I talk about Willard so much. This book is very explicitly, openly, gladly applying Willard's ideas to politics and public life. And I'm happy to talk more about Willard, but Willard has this idea, which was arguably the principal academic pursuit of his life. The concept is called the disappearance of moral knowledge. The concept is not all too distantly related to empiricism or scientism, but the basic argument here is that in the post-World War II era, gatekeepers of knowledge, principally academia, but also other decision makers, decided that and acted as if moral knowledge is not does not fit in the category of knowledge. It is not publicly available and is not fit to be taught in public by public institutions. Well, there are many problems with this, namely that we live in a moral universe, and even if we dismiss moral knowledge as a category, we necessarily have to make moral decisions every day. One of the interesting things, and why I think this concept of the disappearance of moral knowledge is much more helpful than how terminology like post-Christian gets used or all these things. What Willard's very clear about is that the disappearance of moral knowledge is not just, it was not just an imposition from the secular world on the church, but that the church actually contributed to and acquiesced to the disappearance of moral knowledge through its own omission and commission. This retrieval of moral knowledge, I think, is is central for the church itself, but also for the public. I think we need to. I think that pastors have a high calling, and Willard thought of them as spokespeople for Christ. He said nothing that is happening in your local community is more important than that which happens under the administration of faithful pastors for Jesus. But to the extent that the pastorate has become about getting people to do things, about running programs, as opposed to bringing knowledge that is for people's good, then pastors are not in the role that the church needs and that the community in which they serve needs. So that idea of the disappearance of moral knowledge is a critical one. Look, I think there's much more that could be could be said about how the church relates to politics. I mean, I just reiterate, and this obviously includes a lot of consequences and sort of fallout, but I'll just repeat this idea that we need to place political life as part of living life with Jesus, as opposed to this totally alien thing that maybe we have some things that we would want to impose on our politics, but that imposition is totally separated out from the character of our behavior and the character of the church and of the body in the political landscape. That requires a gospel which naturally results in discipleship. And this was, Willard referred to the great omission, this idea that somehow theology and some sectors of American Christianity had developed in such a way that you could have the worst kind of character possible. But so long as you provided mental assent to a few lines of doctrine, you would go to the good place and everyone else would go to the bad place. And he said this is developed in such a way that, as is widely recognized, there is nothing definite that you could say about the character of a Christian and the character of someone who is not a Christian. That's a significant problem. And that has a whole range of public effects. So we could talk much more about that, but those are a few. Oh, just one note is just, I think I might have mentioned this during the talk, but in case I didn't, there's a whole chapter in the book directed specifically towards pastors and parents, which I think are two office holders, so to speak, that are under particular strain in this political moment. So there's a lot of sort of practical guidance in that chapter.
Thank you very much for your wonderful and much needed emphasis on what kind of people we are becoming as the forefront of our question should be as Christians. And you mentioned about politics taking the ultimate position place rather than something, penultimate.
Yeah.
I find that's a very tempting place for many Christians. It has been because politics have taken the ultimate place because of their theologies. Conflated their views of God and return of Christ and things like that has been brought into the place of politics to elevate that as an ultimate thing. I don't know whether that is the correct way I'm expressing, especially the situation in Palestine. I find church has been responsible for this conflict right now happening. And these are, fellow brothers and sisters who named name the name of Christ. So how do we, how do we recognize and this very sensitive area where our political engagement can be hijacked because of our use of God's kingdom and right
Yeah.
over things like
Sure. Two stories, anecdotes. First, I was speaking at an event in New York a few years ago at a church in New York. And after the event, there was a reception with guests at the church. And this really wonderful woman came up to me and started talking. And she was saying, I think it's so lovely that you're there in Washington, D.C., seeking to be faithful to the Lord. It must be so dark a place and so many compromises, and how our politics is so difficult. And the more she talked, the more I got the sense that she was very glad I was trying to be faithful, but probably thought I wasn't being successful. But she was clearly well-meaning, and we talked for 10-15 minutes. And I finally, asked her, why are you in New York? What do you do here? She goes, oh, I work on Wall Street. And so I think the first point I want to make is that politics has unique challenges, but it is not uniquely challenging. I think the questions of faithfulness are live in business in our relationships. Another related story. There's a shooting in Las Vegas some years ago, a mass shooting. And my pastor, when I lived in Virginia, preached a sermon in the wake of that shooting. And in that sermon, he referred to a Barna. Barna is a Christian polling agency. And Barna had this really fascinating two-part question. The first question, I almost want you to ignore the subject. It's been debated for millennia. We could have really, a seminary like this is a perfect place to have really kind of boring and tedious conversations, teasing it all out. But the first question was, if you were, would you use violence to protect your property or your family from an assailant, from some sort of a human threat? And again, this has been debated for a long time. About 75% of the respondents said, yes, I would. Here's the thing that I do think we need to pay attention to in this context. The follow-up question was essentially, do you think Jesus would agree with you? And the numbers almost completely flipped. About 25% of respondents said, I think Jesus would agree with me. And so we could have all kinds of interesting debates, and you could have 95% confidence that your answer is right on the first question, and we could have all kinds of interesting theological discussions. For those of you who are pastors in the room, I do a lot of sort of pastoral counseling, and we do formation work at the Center for Christianity and Public Life, caring about the kind of people right, with a pastoral heart, your attention goes directly to that disintegration of the person. Here is what I think is best and right for me, and here is what I think Jesus would advise and have me do. That divide, our politics is full of that. People consciously saying to themselves, I know Jesus would have this. This would be the ideal. I think Jesus would have me go about it this way. But you know what? If you do that in politics, you're going to get steamrolled. Love your enemies. Yeah, maybe in your personal life. Do that on the public stage and you'll be a chump. That obviously has tremendously destructive impacts for our public life. When we do not feel we can trust Jesus with quote unquote real life. It also makes discipleship completely incoherent, right? So again, we could have all kinds of discussions about the impact it has on our politics and the way in which sort of this kind of thinking, to your question, the way this kind of thinking impacts our politics and public life. I also just, my heart immediately goes to the disintegration of the soul that promotes. And with so many of our public questions, that is what is going on. People actually don't feel, Christians often don't feel as though Jesus is trustworthy when it comes to public issues. One of the more challenging things that Dallas ever taught, and of course he's just simply seeking to interpret Jesus's teaching, which makes this one of the more difficult things that Jesus ever taught, I think. When the disciples are on the boat and Jesus is asleep, the storm comes. Willard said something incredible about that story. He said, when Jesus said to them, "Oh, you of little faiths," he called them little faiths. He said, Jesus wasn't just rebuking them for doubting that he would calm the storm. He was telling them that even if the ship sunk, that he was caring for them, that they were ultimately safe with Jesus. There's great insecurity in the church that has all kinds of public expressions, and that's part of what I'm concerned about and what I address in the book.
Galen, do we have a question?
We have a question online from Pastor Stan Long. Jesus said, "Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." Could you talk about how both the far right and left and the far left violate this, and also help all of us who proclaim Christ as King in this nation can live in the tension?
Yeah, so right, it's interesting. I have a friend. I co-authored a book called Compassion and Conviction. When you co-author a book, you're not supposed to say what you wrote, and I won't say what I wrote. I will say this isn't my idea. My friend wrote it. Chris Butler, points out. Chris Butler points out, the teachings of give unto Caesar, Romans 13, Paul's admonitions about submitting to authorities. What do those teachings mean in a system of government, in a system of self-government? I think that we need to think about questions of complicity, questions of in an entirely different way, given the type of government that we have. And so this is a really complex question. Let me see if I'm always wary of responding to theological questions off the cuff because I want to be very careful, as C.S. Lewis said, not to use God's name in vain when he hasn't spoken. Let me just offer a couple things, and I think the right and the left do this a great deal. Are both sort of subject to this. I think we need to think really carefully as Christians about the difference between what can be done in our politics versus what is edifying to be done in our politics. And one of the really difficult things about politics is that it has the power to create a sort of pseudo reality. This is one of Willard's primary concerns. Willard was very concerned about reality and notions of what is true, very concerned about knowledge. But he said in politics, decisions are not made at the final sort of level by knowledge. They're made by power, by the will of the people. That's, by the way, why it's so important that we have a attentiveness to the kind of people we are, because that is what it does a lot of the decision-making in our politics, not just the raw implementation of truth, of knowledge. And so I think we can often confuse ourselves and think that if we could get the power to do something, then it is right to do it. That the system is sort of self-ratifying in that way. And I think we need to be really careful about that. We need to be able to read the signs of the times. We need to be able to be discerning. And I think both the right and the left can have and can and are currently in danger of confusing the power to do something with the wisdom of being able of doing it. So that would be a sort of general response, a general response I would have to this question, which I appreciate. Thank you.
My question is going to continue with that line of thinking.
Right.
I'm having a hard time putting together my question. I'm trying to figure out how politics gained such a foothold in the church, I would say the last 8 to 10 years. And so it kind of reminds this presentation, this is my first time here, so I really appreciate this, really good. This sort of reminds me of Mark Knowles' Scandal of the Dopamine, where he puts a lot of weight on the scholars, to Christian scholars, not to shine the light better. So let me ask you more of like a C.S. Lewis type of question. If you were writing another chapter in Screwtape Letters, and you were asked, how do I make an impact on evangelical churches? What would you advise as the ways to have a political hook that would tap into churches in such a way to get them to respond to your political view, and instead of honor God?
Yeah. Oh, there's so much to say there. Let me try and give some practical advice.
I'm more.
Yeah. When I ran religious affairs for a presidential campaign. So I looked at what previous religious outreach operations for campaigns have looked like. And the straightforward route, the most direct lever that you can pull, is to simply say, or imply, oftentimes it just gets explicitly said, if you're a real Christian, you'll vote for my candidate. If you're not, then maybe you'll vote for the other guy. This sort of this is going to sound so subtle that maybe you'll think it's not meaningful, but if we could simply shift from saying I am a Christian and therefore I support candidate A or policy A, to saying because of my Christian faith or motivated by my Christian faith, I support candidate A, policy A. Just that subtle shift, what I think it does, and what I'm seeking to do, like the point of that is, we need to make clear that we are in the position of translator, not stenographer of God's word. But that makes religion much less useful to politicians. And it makes religious people who vie for political power using the religious influence they have much less useful to political figures. It took me a long time to sort of come to this sort of realization, but so the structure of the book is, the first chapter is on our current politics, and that's where I talk about political sectarianism. Second chapter is on the disappearance of moral knowledge. The third chapter is on what Willard called gospels of sin management. And Willard described a gospel of sin management. I refer to it as the fixer gospel, which is a result of my probably unwise viewing of too many mafia movies. But all these movies have a fixer. And the fixer is, with the exception of like Pulp Fiction, that was sort of the turn of the movie that was about the fixers. But most of these movies, the fixer, you may not even see the fixer on camera. The fixer is the guy who takes care of the protagonist's problem. There's a dead body on the carpet. The protagonist calls, and there's typically always a line, I don't care how you get it done, just get it done, and then I never want to hear from you again. The fixer gospel is essentially that. It views Jesus as an eschatological widget who takes care of the sin problem. And then everything after that is not essential. It took me a very long time. For so long, what does it mean to have a Christian politics in national American life? Yes, if you go to specific communities, politics works out differently. But in terms of the national sort of dialogue, what does it mean to have a Christian politics? And the answer is you have the right position on a handful of issues. And it doesn't matter how you go about advancing those positions. It doesn't even matter what the consequences of actually implementing those policies might be. The consequences of implementing those policies might be completely contrary to the ends that you were seeking. But so long as you hold the right position on a few issues, you have a Christian politics. And it took me just a very long time to connect the fixer gospel, that to be a Christian meant that you provided mental assent to a few lines of doctrine and you were in, with the way that dominant streams of Christian politics in America have functioned, which is that so long as you're willing to nod yes to the right policy issues, and it's a pretty limited set, you could go about your politics in whatever way you desire. It's a profound problem. The final thing I'd say to this, so I'm happy to talk about more, is I've said before, there's a lot of talk about, particularly over the last 8-10 years, of political homelessness. So people feeling like, because of the events of the last 6-8 years, they're politically homeless. And what I've said is that the crisis is not that Christians are politically homeless, but that we ever thought we could make our home in politics at all. So if you want to know about why we're in the place we are in now, you have to consider why Christians weren't more uncomfortable in our politics. I'll just say it before Trump came. It's actually so much of what's happening in our politics right now is that people haven't quite made the shift to a level of discernment that was never asked of them before. And there are profound issues on the left. But just to finish the point, right? Like, nothing has changed about evangelical voting behavior if you just look at party. The only thing that's changed is a certain number of conservative elites think that 2016 should have been the year that everything that they had told evangelical voters to do prior to 2016, all of a sudden that was supposed to, the matrix was supposed to change. And I just have a little more empathy for people who don't spend their every waking hour thinking about politics. I think a lot of people were told, well, I vote based on, I vote A for one party, that's the Christian party, and I vote based on one issue, and that's it. I don't have any other option. And so I just think we need a bit more. I think we need a longer historical view of how things have developed. And then I think we need to step back from the current political moment a bit and actually start at the fundamental level of what is the gospel? What is God's kingdom? What kind of God? Like, what is the character of God? What is our role in the kingdom? And then within that framework, we could talk about where politics fits in. But if we're only in a mode of reaction, which I think is the problem. So like a problem has been identified. So people are, well, how can we address the problem that's right in front of us? And then they get upset when congregants or people say, well, you're being political, not theological. And in a sense, the critics are right. Like if the response is political, if the reaction is to solve a political problem and not a theological problem, then folks in the pews who have a certain kind of politics have merit in saying, well, you're starting with the wrong thing. So yeah, just to sort of round things out, maybe on this point, I spend a great deal of time in the book talking about anger, and actually, I think this certainly happens on both the right and the left. But there is a profound confidence on the left in anger, in what they think we can do with anger. That has been striking to me. It's the thing that gets the most traction often when I raise the subject or when people read the book, which is in some ways surprising to me. There's very much, I mean, you'll see it as political analysts judge candidates. The ability to channel voters' anger is often considered one of the most important things you could do in politics. That's what success looks like. And there is a great resistance to, I think, the overwhelming counsel of Scripture that we should be very careful with anger, and we should really doubt, as Augustine said, admitting even legitimate anger into our hearts, because he wrote, very quickly can sour the whole vessel. And I don't think that there's enough wariness of anger and what it can do to the heart, and the way that anger, you think that you're cultivating anger for your purposes, but anger is cultivating you for its purposes. And this is a real challenge across our politics. But on the left, it's a pretty serious.
Yeah, thanks for that wonderful presentation. Welcome to Baltimore too. It grows on.
I love it. I love it. Where are you from?
Yeah. Well, pastor just in the northeast section of that city, alumni here too.
Okay,
so
awesome.
very welcome.
I think you have a professor here who was at Canisius. Is that right? Didn't you introduce someone to me last time I was here from Buffalo?
Oh, yeah, because the seminarians from Buffalo, when their seminary closed down, they came and finished
That's
out
right,
here.
exactly. Yeah. Sorry, that's a total aside, but yeah.
Yeah. That's, yeah, just to share a couple takeaways and a little question kind of on the conversation we've been having, as a pastor, I really appreciate that. Turning our attention to the spiritual formation piece. Because I think when we think about, we can get kind of trapped in the temptation to think that, well, the shaping of character takes so much time and energy, but there's an election or a referendum coming up, and we just want to make sure that these people, pull the right lever.
Yeah.
And that character shaping takes a long time, but I think that's a really important reminder. Use the phrase really like to embassies of joy, and of our churches, parishes being embassies of joy, reminded me of St. Paul when he described as being ambassadors of Christ, citizens of heaven, for daily life, and how the scriptures, Jesus himself, so often use political language and metaphor, speaking of the kingdom of God. It's kind of a long way of saying, I wonder if you might just reflect a little bit on how Jesus I just kind of saw him engaging politics and also what do you think is most important or most urgent for creating these embassies of what can we can do?
Let me answer. Yeah, let me answer your question in a slightly different way, but hopefully it'll still be helpful. I've been talking a great deal lately about Acts 8. And in Acts 8, you have two vignettes, one directly following the other. The first is of Simon the magician. And scripture tells us Simon was in Samaria first. He had actually gained some renown for deeds he had performed, miracles he had performed. Then the apostles come and they're healing people, and Simon is actually drawn to them. Scripture actually says Simon believed, which is interesting when you read the church fathers on this, and there's all interesting sort of interpretations of what scripture meant when it says that Simon believed, and Simon makes an offer. He says, if you'll just teach me how to heal people in the name of Jesus, the way that you do, I'll give you some money. And I think there was a bit of like there was a transaction, not just of money, but I think there's an implication of Simon saying like, look, I have some real like capital here. I have resources. Y'all are poor. Let me give you some money. People know me around here. I could really like ingratiate you in with these people. And what's interesting is that he gets rebuked. And he gets rebuked not for the offer, for essentially the bribe or the payoff of the transaction. He gets rebuked for the intent of his heart. And interestingly, Simon is so inattentive to his own heart. Simon thinks so transactionally that his response to the rebuke is, oh, please don't let any of the things you said come to pass. And like the thing is, you just want to be, no, the rebuke is about who you are, not about anything that's going to happen to you. Like, oh, that follows from who you are. Directly following that story is the Ethiopian eunuch, who had a kind of political position. He managed the queen's treasury. And the Ethiopian eunuch is in a chariot. The Holy Spirit calls Philip to run alongside it. The eunuch is reading from Isaiah aloud. Philip asks, like, do you understand it? And he's like, how could I? Like this, I'm just trying to seek knowledge, really. Philip gets in the carriage and begins preaching the gospel to him, starting from that text. And on that carriage ride, they pass a body of water. And the eunuch said, is there any reason why I couldn't be baptized now? Philip says no, and he's baptized. And then scripture says the Holy Spirit called Philip away, but the eunuch was filled with joy. To me, this is I think that this story follows Simon for a reason. And the reason, I think, my suggestion would be that Simon wanted the power of the kingdom of God without becoming the kind of person who the power of the kingdom of God would naturally come to. Whereas the eunuch caught a vision of the gospel, made an intention to follow it, and immediately took up the means to do so. This is what Willard says, this is how spiritual formation always takes place. Vision, intention, means, BIM. Richard Dawkins, who spent much of the 90s trying to get people to not be Christians, has now taken the position that cultural Christianity is really vital for a flourishing society. And so he said, I was in the UK, I think I mentioned in April, and I gave a talk about Richard Dawkins as Simon the magician, wanting the things of God without God himself, wanting a Christian culture without Christians. This seems to me to go very near to the heart of our political problem. This seems to me to be very much the basis on which Jesus interacted with political power in his day, which is go right to the orientation of the heart. And it's out of that that you can get to some of the policy implementation, all of that. But if you're just dealing with the instruments, you can leave the heart untouched, and a untouched heart will just invent new instruments to work out its will.
Yeah, and if I may respond to that, I wonder if, we look at, as you brought up the issues in the church, I wonder if Christians today have, in a sense, adopted that same mentality of Richard Dawkins, and
Yeah.
that our view of politics seems to be much more transactional than
Yes.
spiritual, relational, and that is, as long as we get what we want,
That's
at the
exactly
end,
right.
we can justify.
That's exactly right.
And the church in ways has kind of settled for a kind of cultural Christianity, is just hitting the ends, but not really pursuing the problem.
I agree. I don't know if I'd say that's the only aim, only target of my book, but that is, you just articulated better than I or the marketers at Zondervan articulated what the book is seeking to get at. Yeah. Thanks.
I think with that, we are very close to running out of time, so I want to begin to wind up our time. Sadly, I'm sure the conversation can go on, and there are surely more questions and conversations that continue amongst ourselves. We'll have refreshments afterwards, but just wanted to reflect back a couple of things, and a couple of the questions that I was thinking about asking that you started to address, Michael, were talking about people who are disillusioned with the current situation and becoming passive, people who are wrestling with the temptation to power and political therapeutic deism, and people in conjunction with that second point, people who are more focused on the what and the political outcome than the how and who they're becoming, and engaging in politics in a Christ-like way. With all those, those few things and everything else you heard this evening from folks and questions that you fielded, just wanted to turn it back to you to see if there's anything else you leave us with. I think we all received lots of great exhortations, and I'll say a word in closing afterwards, but if there's anything else you want to share in light of those themes or anything else you heard, feel free.
Nothing immediately comes to mind. So I think I've talked enough. Yeah.
You covered it great. Well, thank you, Michael. Join me in giving Michael a round of applause. We do have a table in the back with books available for $15 that you can available for your purchase. Again, I highly recommend it. And Michael has poured a lot of heart and soul into that book, and a lot of the teachings that you heard tonight stem from and connect with that book. And there's more there. And we will have refreshments out there as well. So please stick around and join us to continue engaging. But thank you everyone again for engaging in the conversation this evening. Thank you.